Nonna's haunting words followed Ludmilla into bed, causing her to rest fitfully through the night. They were still on her mind when she stirred the next morning. Her attach's uncharacteristic outpouring of words had made her ponder all of the experiences she had with the servants of the Sorcerer King so far. Even the words of Lady Sholtia, who was both zealously dedicated and reverent in her service to her liege, seemed to express the same tone from time to time. When she reviewed her memories with the context provided by the Elder Lich, Ludmilla could almost sense the shadows of that same creeping doom from some of their discussions. A desperate prayer composed of unflinching service and unbending loyalty, in hopes that an unfathomable fate would be kept at bay. No one desired to be cast aside. No one enjoyed being unappreciated. But, in Ludmilla's mind, as long as one's life lay ahead of them, there would always be new opportunities and purpose to grasp in the future. Even as a noble who came from a house which had always faithfully served their liege, she felt that she could never fully understand the full depth of what Nonna had described. The dark cloud of her thoughts followed her even as she prepared for the day, and Amelia hovered around her nervously, sensing her mistress' troubled mood. "Is something the matter, my lady?" she asked worriedly as she helped tie up Ludmilla's hair. Looking at Amelia in the reflection of her small mirror, Ludmilla asked a question. "Do servants live for their masters?" "Well, of course they do, my lady," her maid replied matter-of-factly. Amelia finished with Ludmilla's hair and reached for the mantle draped over a stool nearby. Her hand slowed as she inspected the treated cloth for blemishes and debris. "To an extent, or perhaps it would be better to be described in degrees. It depends on what sort of servant they are, and the relationship that they have with their master." Her hands started to move again as she helped to fasten the heavy mantle around her mistress' shoulders. "Even as a lady's maid, I suppose that one day I will want to have a family of my own, and my loyalties would be divided after I do. Not in any sort of improper way, of course." That sounded about right. A very normal response for a human servant, far removed from the unfathomable doom described by the Elder Lich. "I guess there really are some irreconcilable differences between us and His Majesty's servants," she murmured. "My lady, make sure to give your undead assistants lots of work to do," she replied. "They'll probably be happier that way." Ludmilla rose from her seat with a slight smile at her maid's befuddled expression and headed out the door. It was still early, and the morning mist lay thick across the floor of the valley. The villagers appeared to still be getting ready for their day, so she decided to wander around for a bit. The ring of hammer on anvil drew her to the western edge of the village. Ostrich was already at work, or at least it looked like he was working. His forge was lit and there was a dark bar of metal being heated within. "Mornin' Lady Zaradnik," he greeted her as she approached. "You expecting a fight?" Ludmilla was wearing the gambesine she had purchased from the city. The rest of her armor and weapons were still in the manor, but she planned on picking them up before leaving. "Good morning, Mr. Kovalov," she replied. "I'll be spending some time in the woods today. You never know what might pop up, even inside of our borders. Did you still need to speak with any of them before we leave?" "Nah, spoke to 'em yesterday. They know what I need." "What do you need?" Ludmilla was curious. "Once I'm done with this new file here, I'll be almost out of fuel," he explained. "We'll be building mounds to make charcoal with the wood that's harvested." "Will any kind of wood do?" "Yep," Ostrich nodded. "There's no need to be picky about it for now. I just need to keep things going here. Anything that's worth more as lumber or whatever you'll probably be better selling off as is. Once I'm done here, I'll start looking around for ore while the woodcutters do their thing." "You mentioned that yesterday," Ludmilla said. "Just where exactly do you plan on looking?" The smith extended his hand northwards, pointing out towards the flooded plain. "That's a marsh," she stated flatly. "Yes, my lady," he agreed with her description. "If you haven't had a smith here since ever, there's probably enough iron ore out there to help build a small city. Or equip an army. Well, if you've never seen it before you can come back later and I'll probably have collected quite a bit by then." "Well, now you really have me curious. Would you like to test out some of the undead laborers while you're at it? I can send a handful your way." Seeing that I wasn't eaten in my sleep, Ostrich said, "I suppose I could give it a shot. How does it work?" "You tell them what to do, and they'll try to do it." "That's it?" Ostrich furrowed his brow. A better way to put it, Ludmilla said, is that they understand what you want them to do when you order them around rather than follow your words exactly. If you do something like ask them to learn by watching you, or tell them to do things that you have no idea about yourself, it won't work. This means that your own expertise is crucial when directing them. Just don't expect to be putting your feet up as they forge equipment on their own. The skeletons are only capable of straightforward tasks. What happens if I order them to do something too difficult? They just do not do anything, Ludmilla said. Miss Lutzi was able to get them to do all sorts of menial chores. You should be able to figure out what they can do when it comes to tasks revolving around your own work. Huh, he grunted. Well, send 'em on over then. I'll see what I can do with them, my lady. The smith returned to his work, and Ludmilla turned back in the direction from which she had come. A smile appeared on her face as the village girls came down the hill with skeletons in tow to fetch more water. A few of their brothers were doggedly following them, begging for a turn to command their new undead helpers. It was truly a novel sight, one that she would have never dreamed of seeing just a couple of weeks ago. She followed behind the raucous group of children until she reached the flats where the remaining undead still waited from the previous evening. She instructed 4 skeletons to head over to help the smith, then sent half of the bone vultures to deliver the wood which was probably piling up from clearing the fields to a spot outside the village. Recalling Ostrike's words, Ludmilla walked over to the edge of the marshes nearby. Looking down, she could see the various plants that were harvested by the village in the past. She could identify the different types of terrain and vegetation that marked different depths of water, as well as the paths that would safely lead through the flooded lands. She definitely did not see anything that she thought resembled iron ore. Several geese came over hopefully, but were disappointed when she turned away without feeding them anything. In doing so, her eyes fell upon the harbor to the east, where the Nar was moored with its crew. Nonna's words had made her a bit paranoid about making sure all of her undead had some work to do, lest they spiral into some sort of suicidal depression. Perhaps she was thinking too much about it, but she still wondered if there was anything useful for the crew to do when the ship was not transporting anything. She looked down from the pier and the crew looked back up at her. After seeing so many skeletons, she felt that the ones in the ship were noticeably stronger than the regular laborers. Their equipment was different from the simple round shields and spears of the others as well. Instead, they had round metal shields and long scimitars as sidearms. Looking over at the captain, she came upon an idea, heading back up into the village again. After 10 minutes, she returned with a fishing net and a small basket. Since it was armed with many throwing weapons, she thought it should be able to cast a net as well. The captain gave her a look as she handed the net over. Take the ship out on the river and use this net to catch fish, Ludmilla instructed. You may use the whole length of the veil, so take the opportunity to practice maneuvering the ship as well. Keep anything edible around the length of my forearm. When the basket is full, return to the harbor and drop it off in the warehouse. The crew cast off immediately once she stepped back onto the pier. At least it was something, and the crew did not appear to balk at the task. Hopefully, the fish she had brought to mind when issuing the instructions would be what ended up in the basket when she returned. Back at the village, Ludmilla found the woodcutters standing about with their sons. Marin was standing with his things piled about him, looking down the way towards her. Ready for work, Lady Zaradnik, the same man that had spoken for the group before, announced as she walked up to them, provided that there are tools. We checked the warehouse and there wasn't much. Everything is out in the hamlet, she explained. You will be starting just across the bridge and working your way there though. Your equipment will be delivered to you. Mr. Kovalev said that he spoke to you about a few things that he needs. Yes, my lady, he nodded. We'll be marking the cheap timber for charcoal. The rest will be sorted out according to value. That sounds good. I will be stopping by the manor for a bit. Head down and pick up 4 skeletons each while you wait. She walked past them without waiting for a reply, assuming that the boys from before would lead the charge down to pick up their new underlings. It didn't take long before she heard their excited shouts coming from below, oblivious to their father's misgivings. Did this count as using one's children against them? Amelia was speaking to the village women near the manor, and they all turned to greet her when she tried to walk around them. My lady, Amelia said, I was just going over a few things with the women. Will you be headed out to the fields now? Yes, I will be out getting the men started out there. Ludmilla stopped to speak to them. They will be helping to clear the fields before we actually get to the forest beyond the hamlet, so they won't need to use it as a base to work out of until then. Good, one of the women let out a derisive noise. They've been lazing about, surviving on handouts for weeks. It's about time they did something. Speaking of which, what you have here is much better than the barley we've been having recently. You're gonna spoil us rotten with the manna grass alone. Miss Lutzi says that all the geese here are yours as well. Does that mean we'll have plenty of fresh eggs and poultry? The eggs you'll have to personally head out for, Ludmilla told the woman, until we have people specifically managing the flocks. We also occasionally do have poultry to keep the numbers down. Wardensvale is surrounded by the bounty of nature, so, while I cannot say we can match all of the amenities that a city provides, the food is much better here. You should still be appreciative of the new administration's efforts to keep the city fed, however. Lady Shiltier has been working every day, delivering supplies to sustain the people of Eranthal. She is my liege as well. Of course, my lady, the woman stammered. I meant no offense. As long as you understand that His Majesty's generosity is not to be spurned, Ludmilla said to the group. Our lives will all be transformed for the better, in due time. She didn't want to leave the women on what she felt was a sour note, so she turned to Amelia. The undead should have freed up quite a few spare hours. She glanced over the assembled tenants. Is there anything else that the village needs? Yes, my lady, Amelia replied. The homes have a few basic furnishings, so we would like to start weaving mats and coverings and such to make things more comfortable. The warehouse didn't have anything that I could see. Was there something the village used from around here? There are stands of rushes all over the place that you may use, Ludmilla replied. The villagers used rushes, you say? Amelia looked over at the vast carpet of plants in the marsh. Yes, Ludmilla replied. I've only watched them at work, but they were able to draw fibers from the plants. After processing, they were able to make different sorts of cloth for pretty much everything. You should have seen a few examples of it around the village while you were out cleaning the other day. Amelia gave her response some thought before answering. I'll have some samples brought in, my lady, she said. I should be able to figure it out. I'm a weaver's daughter, after all. You can start by trimming down all the plants along the shores surrounding the hill, Ludmilla instructed them. About knee length is fine if you don't plan on using them. You can send your leftovers and refuse to Mr. Kovalev. He seems to know all sorts of things, so he may be able to figure out a use for it. Make sure the shores are trimmed down over the next few weeks, though. I'd rather not have any more would-be heroes popping out to save us again. After deliberating for a few minutes, Ludmilla decided to only bring a portion of her equipment along, fastening the hatchet to her hip beside her dagger, fastening her braces and pulling on her gauntlets before grabbing her spear. With as many undead as there were with the ongoing evaluations, she highly doubted there would be any demi-humans or monsters brave enough to stick their noses into the fields to cause trouble. Wild animals were generally even more timid, and all of the undead activity would also keep them at bay. On her way out of the village, she saw that the woodcutters had sorted themselves out. One of them ran his gaze over her armament as she approached them. Why the weapons, my lady? He asked nervously. Things may look nice and peaceful right now, Ludmilla smiled, but this is still the frontier. Demi-humans, monsters and everything else should be smart enough to stay away with all of the undead around, but one can never be too sure. You'll be working to clear up fallow land around the hamlet nearby for the next week or so. The undead watching the area will have a clear view of your surroundings, so you should be safe. Just run to the nearest Death Knight in the event that something scary comes along. I'll be headed into the woods for something else after I get you all started. Ludmilla rounded up the unclaimed undead and led her hodgepodge of tenants and laborers across the bridge to the beginning of the fields. Being the closest to the harbor village, they had seen the least neglect, yet still had new shrubs and trees intermittently sprouting up from where rows of grain were to be planted. She stopped on the road and turned around to address the woodcutters. All of these terraces, including the portions of the windbreaks encroaching on the fields, need to be cleared so they can be prepared for planting. There are teams of undead working their way out from the hamlet that you'll eventually come across, so all I need for the time being are the stands of trees removed and the timber sorted out for transport to the village. The teams of undead laborers will take care of the rest. The Death Knights that I leave with you will help as well. If there's anything that requires heavy labor, such as stubborn stumps or roots, they should be able to take care of it. They'll also be taking turns transporting timber to the village as it becomes available, so let them know how you're going to be organizing our inventories down on the flats. There will always be one standing guard nearby, but pay attention to your surroundings once in a while just in case something comes along. The bone vultures she had sent ahead of them were already arriving to deliver the axes, picks and shovels that she thought they would need. The men took the equipment, fanning out into the fields, and Ludmilla continued on her way. A few of the undead flew overhead every few minutes, following her instructions to deliver pieces of wood removed from the fields to the smith. There was a veritable wall of debris running along the road that stood higher than her waist and 3 times as wide from all the clearing that had been done so far. The original team of undead had cleared the 3rd field and was now working on a 4th, while the 2 sets of death knights working the plows were working through the 2nd field. She stopped them as they passed by to see what their blistering pace had done to the equipment. In addition to the damage from their first run, more had accumulated besides. It clearly would not survive at this rate. Ludmilla instructed them to continue their work at half the speed. Until she could get her hands on something more durable, she didn't want to deal with the delays involved in the replacement of something that could currently only be purchased in the city, if there were even any left. Walking a short distance further, she stopped where Nonna was watching over a second team of skeletons working to clear a field on the other side of the road. "What are you doing here?" Ludmilla asked. "Collecting data for a control sample." The elder lich did not turn from her observations. "What does that mean?" "It is a baseline used to compare sets of experimental results to. In this case, I am collecting information to be compared to undead teams commanded by you, and the group that will be controlled by this new farmer." "I see," Ludmilla said. "Then I suppose I should leave you to your work." "Yes. Actually, one thing, how long did the plow teams take to finish the 1st field?" "Roughly 26 hours, Nonna replied. The measurements of the fields are imprecise, there was some overlap in the work. At their former rate, it meant that the 2 teams were plowing roughly 9.5 acres per hour. It was an order of magnitude more than what a team of draft animals using the same equipment could achieve, not factoring in that the undead were untiring and could work day and night. She figured that, even at half speed, the undead she had initially requested would have only taken roughly a month and a half between clearing, plowing, sowing and harrowing. There was still enough time to achieve 2 harvests this year, and something that could easily be accomplished if the preparations for the first sowing had been done in the winter. Of course, with 4 times the labor, it should be done in a little over a week. Ludmilla still couldn't quite believe it though, even as it started to play out before her eyes. The 2 remaining teams of undead for the farms had ordered themselves along the road going through the center of the hamlet. She allowed Morin time to pick one of the abandoned buildings to move into and took one of the groups of undead awaiting instructions to get them started on their work. When she returned, the short farmer was standing over the well, looking down into it. "Is there water?" Ludmilla asked, realizing she hadn't checked. "Yes, I can see the sky's reflection from below," he answered as he straightened himself. "The last group of undead here will be under your direction." She walked over to where they were waiting. "The other tenants seem to be able to handle 4 without much difficulty, but I've heard that excessive numbers can result in various problems. As you've probably heard me explain to the others, these skeletal laborers will carry out your instructions as you envision them, but they cannot carry out tasks that are too complex. They will continue with their orders until they complete them or are instructed to do otherwise, so you may be able to manage them by assigning them to tasks that take long spans of time or may be repeated many times. I'm rather new at this myself, so as a farmer, you may be able to achieve superior results with your expertise." Morin walked over to the formation of undead, slowly examining them row by row. He gave an experimental order, and a group of 4 of them stepped forward. He tried again with the same results, looking over sheepishly at Ludmilla. "It seems 4 is my limit," he said apologetically. "Try what I mentioned earlier," she suggested. "Set those 4 on their task and come back for more." As he moved to follow her advice, Ludmilla headed over to the barn. The undead vultures that she had set as sentries were still watching over the building, and she spotted several dead rodents in front of the door. Just inside, there was a pile of broken tools and she used her foot to sift through the damage. There were a few broken hafts, but most of it appeared to be damage to the iron itself caused by their indiscriminate use by the tireless undead. She instructed several of the undead that had followed from the village to load the pieces onto the nearest cart. She would take them on her way back to the village to see if they could be repaired. Nonna had reported that 15% of the equipment had failed, and they had completed plowing roughly the same percentage of the field, so, even if Ostrike couldn't effect proper repairs, they should still be able to complete the work with all of the equipment that the new teams had brought with them. Morin had finished setting half of his team to task by the time Ludmilla finished looking through the barn. She walked out to the field he was working on, and found that the undead that had started clearing it were working slower than the ones that she commanded. Was it because of her ability? Or was it because Morin was still new at directing the undead? The farmer returned with the next group. His instructions seemed shaky, but he seemed to understand what needed to be done. She didn't think one's confidence would affect the results of their directions, but that was only a hunch. He blew out a heavy sigh as he set the last group to work. Going back and forth between his undead laborers, he would pause to issue corrections frequently. Maybe there was another reason for his slower pace. "How often do farming tools break?" Ludmilla asked him as he continued with his task. "Ones like these?" Morin replied, "Gem, they should last a year or two, at least. Longer, if you're careful and take good care of them." "A year or two?" She was losing them at a far greater rate than that. "Nonna told me that I've lost 15% of my tools in the past day alone," Ludmilla said. "Do you have any idea why this might be the case?" "They shouldn't be breaking that often," Morin said. "If the tools are from the same place, well, who gave the instructions for them?" "That would be me," Ludmilla replied. She looked over to the remaining undead awaiting orders and commanded them to start clearing. Unlike Morin Bohr, who could only direct 4 at a time, the entire group went to work immediately. The farmer frowned. "Is there a trick to that?" he asked. "I'm not too sure, myself," Ludmilla answered. "You're the first human I've had to compare to, but it already appears that there are a few notable differences between us." "That might be just a bit of an understatement," Morin chuckled. "Does that mean the other undead out in the fields are also following your instructions?" "Aside from the group being controlled by Nonna, yes." "Well, nobles are used to ordering around lots of people," Morin mused. "Maybe it doesn't matter what they are." Lady Shiltier's words to her about the differences in vocations and classes came to Ludmilla's mind. When she had first heard them, extraordinary skills and feats filled her mind, but even things that she considered mundane appeared to be affected as well. If that was the case, she would have to consider things more carefully than she had initially thought she needed to. "My skeletons seem to be acting out their orders in a different way than yours are," Ludmilla said. "Could you take a look at them and tell me what you think?" Morin walked over to where her skeletons were clearing the field. It wasn't long until he looked back up towards her. "I think I know why your tools are breaking, at least," he said. Ludmilla came over to join him, but she couldn't see anything wrong with what the skeletons were doing. "Why is that?" she asked. Morin looked at her strangely for a moment before his face lit up in comprehension. "A few years back," he told her, "we had some adventurers come by our village for a job, platinum rank ones. They used the village as a base for their work for about a week or so, and one of them got curious about our work. Eventually he joined some of us working out in the fields, wanting to try his hand at the whole farming thing. The man was strong and fast, but in the end what he was doing was basically the same as what these skeletons were doing. We had to politely convince him to stop before he started damaging our property too much." "What was he doing wrong?" "Well, rather than doing something wrong, he just didn't know how to do it properly." Morin glanced at the spear in her hand. "I guess it might be easier to use weapons as an example, since you're a frontier noble. A regular guy will look at a spear and think that sticking someone with the pointy end is all there is to it. Then you watch someone who knows what they are doing and it looks anything but. Just like a spear is a tool for fighting, you have tools for everything else. If you haven't learned the trade, then all you might think is that a blacksmith is banging metal with a hammer, a teamster is just riding along with their wagon, or a farmer is just digging holes or cutting grass. Sure, you might get the job done in the end doing what you're doing, but there's always a better way to do it." Ludmilla was already feeling embarrassed halfway through his explanation. Especially considering it was her own explanation, just delivered in a more specific context. The work of undead laborers relied on the expertise of their director. A farmer would obviously know how to do their job better than she would, and thus be better at directing undead labor used for farming. Even as she was making requests for various professions to migrate to Warden's Vale, she only knew how things roughly fit together through her upbringing. She didn't have an intricate understanding of how each piece of the puzzle worked. I meant no offense, my lady. Morin started to back away. My mouth just ran off with me. No, it's all right, Ludmilla cleared her throat. I'm just a bit embarrassed over how I've instructed you on how to direct the undead, yet somehow the meaning of what I've said hasn't sunk in for myself. You're grasping these new tasks quite rapidly. When I first put up the posting asking for people willing to immigrate to my domain, I didn't think anyone would take to their work this quickly. Morin let out a shaky laugh at her words. A part of me thinks this is still some sort of dream, he said. I wasn't sure what would happen. Are you going to be all right all alone here? Ludmilla asked. There will be more tenants coming in eventually, but you're all that there is here until I make my next trip to Erantal at least. Being surrounded by so many undead must feel unsettling for someone unaccustomed to it. I don't mind, he said. I find the undead quite fascinating, actually. Ludmilla looked at him sharply. That was definitely not something someone would normally say. Perhaps she could finally discover the root of the unease that he had generated in her maids. I think you should explain what you mean by that. Morin's expression changed as he realized what he had confessed in his idle chatter. His mouth opened and closed several times before he settled on what to say. When I was younger, I had a phase of sorts, he said nervously. I took an interest in the undead for some reason. They were something dark and mysterious that was far beyond my dreary life at my family's farm. I got deeper and deeper into it until I fell in with a group of shady folks in the nearby town. I did things here and there for them, cleaning and other chores, delivering messages and such. They taught me a little bit of magic in exchange. I was too much of a coward to learn any necromancy, though. I was raised under the ways of the four great gods, and there was always that little voice tugging at my conscience that kept me from learning anything more than a few basic spells. I just grew out of it after that, but there's still a part of me that finds their work interesting. So you're a mage, then? Ludmilla asked. Of a sort, Morin answered. Didn't save me from the levy, though. The Lord's men came through and I got swept away alongside a bunch of other people from my home village. They marched us off the Erantal, where I got a spear stuck in my hand and a sergeant that hated everyone unconditionally. I barely survived Katsa. Now that he mentioned it, his unstable presentation and pale look did resemble some of the survivors that returned to Warden's Vale after the battle. Ludmilla felt bad for him and for the disparaging comments that had been made by her household. The idea that he had fallen in with a group of necromancers still made her wary, though. Such practices were taboo in Riestais out of concerns that the practice might lead to the rise of more undead. It was an ultimately superficial sentiment, however, given the current state of the kingdom's former territory. As a noble commanding hundreds of the undead, serving an undead vassal of an undead king, she made his past activities seem a pittance in comparison. But you still made it out alive, Ludmilla said. Why didn't you return to your family? I came from the Heartlands, a village under a baron on the other side of Pespi's territory. With the army shattered, it was every man for himself. A lot of the territories along the way home aren't as well managed as the ones in Erantal, and even this duchy had the signs of various problems that I could see on the way in. Many of the nobles don't care or can't afford to keep their lands secure. Even worse are the ones that are in league with the thugs and bandits that run amok in their lands. It was safe enough to come in with the royal army, but unless you're able to pay for their tolls or have an armed escort like the merchants do, you're more than likely to end up dead or a slave if you try to travel alone. Knowing that, I decided to take my chances staying in the city. Ludmilla's eyes narrowed as he spoke. She was appalled at the idea that any noble could willingly suffer those conditions in their domain. She was equally appalled by the idea that their own respective lieges could even allow it to happen. It was a clear breach of noble contract in Riestais to allow such lawlessness, never mind participate in it. How was it that such nobles were not immediately sanctioned or even stripped of their titles so they could be managed by more capable lords? The lord of a fief governed autonomously, but that autonomy came with obligations to both land and liege. The story of the Lynham sisters floated out of her memory, She had been unwilling to believe that such a thing could have happened, but if the rest of Riestais had places where these practices had become commonplace, then perhaps the Duchy of Rantel had been influenced by it to some degree as well. Anyways, Morin continued, rubbing his arm in a nervous-looking manner. I came across your posting the other day and thought that I fit your requirements in a strangely faithful way. I was a farmer, and I wasn't scared of the undead. I thought maybe I could put everything I had learned to good work for the Lord here, maybe learning some necromancy would be useful. Ludmilla had no immediate answer to his question as she had no experience with it. Considering their new reality, it was a certainty that the laws and customs surrounding the practice of necromancy would be changed. It didn't guarantee that one could do whatever they wanted, however, there should be regulations concerning its use, but such regulations would need to be laid out by those who were experts in its applications. Do you think there are more groups around like the one you fell in with? Ludmilla asked. Oh, I have no doubt about that, Morin said. In fact, I heard there was some incident in Rantel where some crazy fellows tried to do something in the cemetery. They were stopped by adventurers, but where there's one, there's probably more. There were a few in this case. Morin stopped speaking to correct some errors in what the skeletons were doing that Ludmilla still could not discern. After observing their work for a minute, he returned to speak to her. Even if there aren't, he said, word will spread about a nation that openly uses the undead, ruled by a powerful undead king. It will draw them like ants to honey. Ludmilla frowned. That the Sorcerer's Kingdom would become a popular destination for crazy necromancers was definitely not something that had ever crossed her mind. She hoped she could deal with it when the time came. Leaving Morin to his work, Ludmilla left the hamlet with her questions for the man, having led to dozens of other questions. She made her way northwest along the old road, at the forefront of a group of undead, pondering new perspectives and information, trying to apply it in ways that might work with her current knowledge and rethinking how she would go about laying the foundations of her domain. After roughly half an hour, she came to the thickly forested slopes of the valley beyond the fields, where the road disappeared into the undergrowth. It had finally come time to test out some of her own ideas. After Lady Shiltier's presentation of the various types of undead available for lease, Ludmilla had requested a group of undead beasts in the form of boars with the idea that they, like the wild boars that lived out in the wilderness, could sniff out roots, mushrooms and the many other edible fruits and plants from the forest. As she picked her way through the woods, she came across a cluster of broad white fungus that was favored in the village's ubiquitous stew growing out of a tree trunk. After a few minutes puzzling over how exactly she could issue the instructions, she sent the undead boars out into the forest. Ludmilla watched with some alarm as they immediately sprung into action, crashing noisily through the woods. She caught up to the first undead beast, which had stopped several hundred meters away. It had found some mushrooms, but besides looking vaguely similar to the ones she sent it out to look for, they were deadly if eaten. Out of the first set of undead she had sent out, only one had found what she had instructed them to find. Ludmilla tried improving on her commands with the same group, then sent them out again. This time, none of them were able to locate what they had been sent to find. There were very clearly other patches of the same mushrooms around. She occasionally stopped to put them into a basket as she followed the undead beast's rampage, but they were somehow unable to recognize them, despite their director clearly being able to. What they did do, however, was create an extraordinary amount of damage in their search, bowling over small trees, uprooting medicinal plants and destroying flowering bushes that would have produced summer berries. While they appeared to be like boars, the only quality that these undead beasts seemed to convey was the destructive image associated with one. The first of her ideas not outlined in the materials provided by the administration appeared to be a catastrophic failure. She wondered if it had already been attempted and left out due to the same findings. It would have been nice for them to leave a note of some sort if this was the case. She descended down the valley towards the flooded marshes, continuing to forage fresh shoots and other spring edibles along the way. 3 of the wicker baskets carried by the skeletons in the group were filled by the time she reached the soggy edges of the floodplain. Ludmilla immediately spotted a cluster of broad, arrow-shaped leaves standing out of the water and waded over with a bone vulture after pulling off her boots and tucking the hem of her gambesine up into her belt. She couldn't find a tuber near the base of the plants by feeling around with her toes, so she had to reach into the knee-deep water, feeling around until she came up with an arrowhead tuber which fit in the palm of her hand. The arrowhead plants grew all over the valley, and their starchy tubers had become the staple of the village in her generation as the population of the barony dwindled to the point that the farmlands could no longer be properly cultivated. They were similar to the potatoes that were grown in the Empire, albeit much smaller, and, after she had been served the fried strips by Yuri Alpha, she had wanted to see if these could be prepared in a similar manner. With the tuber in hand, she issued directions to the bone vulture, which was completely submerged aside from its head and long neck poking out of the water. After sending it out into the marsh, she continued harvesting her own as she awaited the results. There was not much in the way of recommendations provided by the administration's materials for marshy terrain, so this was another idea that she had puzzled out for herself. It could be difficult for humans to navigate the deeper parts of the marsh, but a bone vulture could get around easily by flying, or so she thought. Looking out across the water, she saw the head of her test subject still poking out above the surface as it slowly waded through the marsh. It wasn't until it found a sandbar which was shallow enough for it to raise most of its body above water that it shook itself dry and rose into the air. Well, at least as the water levels receded, their mobility would improve. She directed more bone vultures, each sent out to harvest a different type of plant, and, as they either succeeded or failed in their tasks, Ludmilla developed a loose understanding as to what would work and what would not. For the bone vultures, if the target of their efforts had very clear and distinguishable characteristics, such as the arrowhead plants with their large, arrow-shaped leaves standing well above the surface of the water, success was nearly guaranteed. Bulrushes and other reed-like plants they could vaguely recognize by appearance, and, since the different plants were all useful for one thing or another, Ludmilla also considered those a marginal success. The more a plant resembled the growth around it, however, the more their success rate approached that of the undead beasts in the forest. Sometimes she would receive a bundle of watercress, sometimes she would get a bundle of weeds or a bunch of moss. In several trials, a bone vulture would make such a gross misidentification that it returned with what one of the others had been sent to collect instead. After a couple of hours gauging the results, she decided that they were worth using to harvest only a handful out of the many useful plants that grew in the marsh. If the prices for produce fell too far, she would have to figure out some other worthwhile use for them. Ludmilla sent them to collect arrowhead tubers for the time being in order to increase the dwindling stocks of food in the village. Each bone vulture gripped the strap of a shallow basket which could be floated on the water's surface as they landed to find food. When the human population of her domain increased, she would have to raise new rangers to help with foraging activities in both the marsh and the forest. With one disastrous failure and a sort of success, she scaled the slope back up to the farming hamlet with the remaining undead. She crossed the field Morin was working on first, and the farmer nodded as she approached. "How are things going?" Ludmilla asked. "It's an interesting challenge," he said, leaning on a stick he had picked up from somewhere. "Since they will continue working with their current orders until they complete them, it makes it possible to control many sets of skeletons as long as the time it takes for them to work is long enough for you to set new instructions with the others. That number shrinks dramatically if I try to manage more precise tasks, however. 4 seems to be the number, at least for me, if the goal is to maintain the same quality of farm work as a human with each one." "Make sure you let Nonna know," Ludmilla told him. "This is just the sort of information she's looking for." The ratio Morin presented meant that roughly 20 farmers would be needed to direct the 80 skeletons working the fields for one hamlet. Accounting for shortfalls in labor due to illness or injury, she thought 25 would be more reasonable. On the other hand, once she was able to bring in a new priest, the problem should be next to non-existent. While it was still dependent on the actual results, her estimation that a single farmer could easily provide for their entire household meant that the hamlet would flourish with the abundance, freeing up labor for other industries. It would quickly become a village and a base from which to extend the fields further along the valley, after which she could found a new hamlet that would develop in a similar manner to continue expansion. With plans for 5 more farming villages with a similar allotment of land, Ludmilla became hopeful that, with the solid foundation established by the chain of future settlements, she would be able to transform the harbor village into a town filled with the specialized labor and industries that would be needed to stay ahead of the changes that the Sorceress Kingdom's undead labor would bring to the regional economy. She would certainly have food aplenty, enough grain to feed the entire population of the city of Erantal, but more specialized development would take time. All of the timber harvested by clearing land for the fields could be exported to meet the future demand that Lady Sheltier had spoken of to Gareth Boyce, and the proceeds would be used to help to push the development of the Warden's Vale. Perhaps she should see to building the mill soon in order to improve the productivity of her domain. After that, she would need to hire prospectors and other specialists to explore her lands for other resources to develop. The vision of unprecedented growth filling her head put Ludmilla into a good mood, and she hummed happily as she made her way back to the hamlet. As far as her plans for the day went, she would be returning to the village with the broken and damaged equipment while checking on how the woodcutters were doing along the way. Directing a few skeletons to add the additional damaged tools that had appeared while she was away to the cart with the rest, she then instructed one of the 2 Death Knights in her escort to pull the vehicle along. As it leaned over to grasp the tongue of the cart, Ludmilla had a thought. Actually, hold on a bit, I have a different idea. She had struggled to think of what to do with the undead beasts after finding them unsuitable for what she had intended them for. Churning up the fields for clearing would only be a short-term use, and she wanted to find something more permanent. Ludmilla motioned for 2 of the boars to come forward and she secured them to the yoke attached to the tongue of the cart. Sitting in the seat, she ordered them to circle around the well in the center of the hamlet. Finding that they were able to accomplish the task without issues, she went to attach 2 boars to each to the 3 remaining carts. There were still 3 undead beasts left, but there would be more carts built in time to meet the demands for transport. If they worked for the long term, using undead beasts would be much more cost-effective than soul eaters for pulling these smaller vehicles. The small train of carts traveled back eastwards along the road towards the harbour village, stopping periodically for the Death Knights to load a tree stump or other pieces of debris that had been too heavy for the bone vultures to deliver. The procession stopped when they neared the end of the fields, and Ludmilla hopped off to see how the woodcutters were doing. They came in from their work to gather around her and report their findings. We lost 4 skeletons in all so far, Lady Zaradnik. The man submitting their report seemed a bit apologetic and more than a little miffed. Most villagers learn how to play it safe around skeletons and zombies that pop up now and then, but it turns out they're just as mindless when they're working for you. Each of our groups lost one felling our first tree. They have no sense of self-preservation, so they just stood still to get crushed. Then another one was lost when we forgot to tell it to get out of the way sometime later. 4 makes it too crowded to work. It's hard to look out for the other woodcutters and these skeletons at the same time. How many do you think you can work with, then? Ludmilla memorized his report to relay to Nonna. 2 to a team, probably. 3 if the third is just moving things to and from the site. He scratched his head through his cap. Don't get me wrong, they're good for what we're using them for, but if there's too many running around it will just cause more accidents. It's dangerous work. Hacking down trees is the least of it. We have to prepare and plan ahead to make sure everything goes smoothly. I understand, Ludmilla nodded. Once the fields have been restored, I plan on clearing stretches of the slope in sections about the same size as the ones here. How many more woodcutters do you think I can bring in before the numbers become a hazard? How wide will the fields be, my lady? He asked. A 5-kilometer width between the edge of the marsh and the valley slope, about the width you see at the hamlet over there. The fields will follow the old road up to where it leaves the valley. If we're clearing through in a line, 1 team every 100 meters should be safe, he said after some thought. Well, it also depends how much work you'll have for us after all this is done. I'd feel bad for the ones that are sent away if there's no work to be had after. I'll keep that in mind, Ludmilla said. So a team is 2 skeletons and 2 men, my lady. Will there be any problems working out of the hamlet? The man exchanged glances with the other woodcutters, turning back to her with a shrug. If we can take our families with us, he said. I don't see any reason not to, especially since it'll be saving us a long walk. Most of the buildings in the old hamlet were run down. She would need to find tradesmen capable of fixing them up and building new ones if she planned on expanding it into a village. At this rate, the population of the farming settlement would become larger than the harbour village, as it would take more time to attract the advanced industries that she wanted to base out of the future town. Were there any other problems? Ludmilla asked. Not really, no, he answered. With the undead labor, we get through everything a lot faster and there's not much of a need for breaks. We haven't felled any trees worth shipping out as building material yet, but how do you want them moved? Before, Ludmilla said, Our villagers had to divide into lighter sections on site before transporting the timber to the village, but with the Death Knights here, we might be able to keep them whole. Once the field work is done, we can add the plow teams as well. I'm not sure exactly how much they can handle, but it should be quite a lot. You'll want to put them to the test before deciding what's safe to transport. That sounds reasonable, my lady, the man said. If we get any trees that are too heavy, we'll cut them lengthwise into sections that they can manage if they team up, unless you want to keep them bigger than what that ship of yours can carry. It should be fine, for now, Ludmilla said. I believe we'll be storing the timber on the flats near the harbor. Are there any preparations that you need to make for the stockpile before deliveries start arriving?
Yes.
We can get that done quickly when we get back this evening. Also, there will be a mill at some point. I would like to start construction as soon as possible if I'm to bring in more woodcutters.
The man nodded at her words.
A mill will help you pack more onto that ship of yours and bring in more coin since you'll be doing a lot of the work sizing the lumber here. The rest I have no idea about. You'll have to find a carpenter or something to help with construction. We'll carry on here, my lady. If you can spare them, we could use a couple more skeletons on standby just in case there are more accidents.
Of course, Ludmilla said. I'll leave a few of the available ones here on the road for when you need them.
Thank you, Lady Zaradnik, the man said, and the group bowed in an uncoordinated way, for everything. We'll be getting back to work, then.